as you would expect, I completed several theology classes during my time in seminary. Now, those classes required a good bit of reading of many different theologians. But I have to tell you, I'd often marvel at my classmates and colleagues who, in the midst of a conversation, can come up with a relevant quote from some theologian. If we are engaged in a conversation, it's not as likely that I will come up with a quote from a theologian. Now, I may be able to come up with a line from a song by Harry Chapin or Chicago, or a line from the TV show like MASH, but not necessarily as likely that I'm going to come up with a quote from a theologian. But there's an exception. There's two statements of Karl Barth, there he is, that I can quote from memory. I'm going to share one of them with you today. It's a principle that's been paraphrased from what he originally said, but I heard it about 10 years ago, and to a certain extent, it guides my ministry. Barth suggested that when we preach, we have the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other hand. And this is advice that I've taken seriously. So every morning, as part of my morning routine, I flip through the electronic version of the Pocono Record to see what's going on in the world, at least in the Poconos. Now, reading this record this last Wednesday, I was reminded of an incident involving my dad. Now, there's Mom and Dad. If you can see, that picture was taken June 10th, 2006, at their 50th wedding anniversary dinner. So here's another picture of my mom and dad, about 49 years before that. Now, the difference between the two pictures is I'm in this one. So my mom and dad were in North Cape May 5 or 6 years. It's around 1984. And my dad was bit by the public office bug again. It happened in 1973 when we lived in Roslyn, and he unsuccessfully sought a seat on the Township Board of Commissioners. But it was different this time around. This time my dad was successful in his bid for a seat on the Lower Township Council. Now, for whatever reason, this election was held in June, and the winners were sworn in shortly thereafter. Debbie, Nate, and I, and that's how I know that it was around 84, 85, because Zach wasn't in the picture yet. Debbie, Nate, and I made the trip from Warwicksburg to attend the ceremony. Our celebratory mood was interrupted by a phone call that Sunday morning. Seeing that overnight some individuals chose to paint racist graffiti at the home of an African-American family in the community. This was an incident of racist vandalism similar to what occurred in Mount Pocono last week that I saw on the record. So instead of a ceremonial meeting later that day, the newly elected council was facing their first challenge. There were 5 members of the council. Both political parties were represented. And after they finished taking their oaths of office and dealing with the business of organization, the mayor addressed the elephant that was sitting in the room. And after he spoke, each council member was given a chance to speak. And each one of them, including my dad, condemned the attack on the residents of their community. After all, these folks were siblings in God, also made in the image and likeness of God. My dad and the other council members were providing comfort to their residents, and they were creating a path for God's glory to be seen. So like last week, our Hebrew Bible reading this week is from Isaiah. Last week we heard a lament from chapter 64, from near the end of 3rd Isaiah. This week, we hear the first 11 verses of chapter 40, which are also the first 11 verses of what we call 2nd Isaiah. So the first 39 chapters are 1st Isaiah, and they're written before the exile. The 2nd Isaiah is as the exile is coming to a close, and this map can show you the 2 different times of exile and where the people were exiled to in those 2 times. And there was no buses or anything to so they walked those distances. Now here's the thing about Isaiah that's a little different. And the thing that kept coming to mind this week as I was preparing was the Harry Potter series. Now, I'm sure there are many people in this room more familiar with the Harry Potter series than I am. But my hunch is that there was, a year and a half, 2 years between books? Maybe 3? Something like that? Well, here's the thing about 1st Isaiah and 2nd Isaiah. Scholars tell us it was 150 to 200 years between the last words of chapter 39, 1st Isaiah, and the words we heard this morning that begun chapter 40. And the tone changed dramatically. 1st Isaiah is a book of warnings and judgments and calling people out for turning their backs on God. 2nd Isaiah opens with an instruction to the prophet. Comfort, God says. Comfort, O comfort. And then God adds 2 words that must have been incredibly reassuring to the exiles. My people. They've been in exile for years. Their city was destroyed. Their identity was taken away from them. And I have to believe they felt that God was no longer with them. And here God is telling the prophet, comfort my people. Speak tenderly to their hearts, God said. Tell Jerusalem that the sentence has been served, the penalty is paid, and the slate is wiped clean. Wouldn't it be nice if a person released from prison and returning to our communities today would hear those same words? And then the voice cries out, in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. And then the voice describes the land preparation task. Lift up the valley, make low the mountain and the hill, level the uneven ground and the rough places. Now take notice to what the text, though, did not say. The text does not say God will make straight a highway. It says we are to make straight a highway for God. Now let's think about that for a minute. That's quite an excavating job there. Lift the valley, make low the mountain, level the uneven ground. Now remember, this was written before Connect Plumbing and Excavating and Hoffman Excavating were around. So the exiles didn't have heavy equipment. So how were these folks supposed to do all this? In the wilderness, the voice of the prophet is referring to heavy equipment isn't necessary to lift up the valley and make low the mountain. The exiles can do it themselves, and we can do it ourselves. You see, the wilderness that the text is referring to is not a place. You can't find it on a map. The wilderness this text is referring to is within the exiles, collectively and individually. This text is addressed to a community, the community of the exiles. It's telling them that they need to look inside themselves and break down the valleys, break down the barriers and fill the valleys that keep God out of their lives. Yet to do that as a community, doesn't each individual have to look at the barriers they put before God? And when they do that, when they break down those barriers and fill those valleys, then the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all the people will see it together. 500 or so years later, another prophet comes along. The gospel text today is from Mark, and it tells us that as it is written in the prophet Isaiah, "See, I am sending my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way." The voice of one crying out in the wilderness, "Prepare the way of the Lord. Make his paths straight." John the Baptizer appeared in the wilderness, proclaiming a baptism of repentance and forgiveness of sins. So now here we are, 2,000 years later. And we still hear the word of that prophet. Prepare the way of the Lord. Make God's path straight. The words of the prophet are addressed to us as a community. and each of us individually, and the church chooses to repeat them during the season of Advent. In this Isaiah text and in the gospel text, we're being asked to reflect. We're reminded that despite the stores and the parties and the TV specials, Advent is a time of penitential preparation. It's a time to remove the barriers and to create a path for God as a community and as individuals so that God's glory can be revealed. Catherine Matthews reminds us that in Advent, we attune our hearts and minds to the many ways God enters our lives and the life of the world. While we focus on the way we organize our lives as a community and our collective deep longing for hope, we should not underestimate the collective effect of individuals desiring to encounter God every day. So what mountains or valleys are in my life that prevent God from accessing my highway? Is there a spiritual discipline or practice that can help level the mountain or fill the valley? The year before my dad died, my nephew who lives in Iowa got married. The wedding was on a Saturday afternoon, so I arranged to fly to Cedar Falls Friday morning and to leave to return home early Sunday morning. I was counting on the airlines coming through so that I could make it home for the Sunday evening service at our church. If the flights were delayed, I wouldn't make it. I had given my sister my flight information, and she arranged it so that she, my nieces, and my parents were on the same flight out to Iowa. When I got to the airport, I asked my sister if we had the same flights home. She said no. Dad would not let me book a flight until the afternoon so they could make Mass in the morning. See, Dad wasn't buying the argument that the wedding ceremony on Saturday would count as Mass for Sunday. But my dad was making a statement. Sabbath was a priority for him. Sabbath was far more important to my dad than an early flight home. What does Sabbath look like for us? Does Sabbath get pushed aside because we have convinced ourselves that something else is more important? You know, I joke about the things that they don't teach you in seminary, but one of the things we did talk about a lot was the challenge of Sabbath for a pastor, especially for someone like me that doesn't like to stop until everything is finished. And is there ever a time when everything is finished? My dad was showing me how important it was to put the world aside and make room for God. My dad created a path for God. And because my dad created a path, God was revealed. I could stand here and tell you stories for quite a while. But it wasn't just his life individually my dad looked at. My dad also wanted to break down the barriers and create a path for God in his community. Be it where he lived, where he went to church, or organizations he was involved in. He was part of the community in creating a path for God when he spoke out against the racist graffiti that day. He was part of the community in creating a path for God as he served on the town council and later on the utility authority. And he was part of the community in creating a path for God in his role as financial secretary of the Knights of Columbus. 7 years ago, last Sunday, God called my dad home. Now, I have no doubt that my dad's passage through the pearly gates was delayed a few minutes, because there's no doubt in my mind that when my dad got there, he got his plumb bob out to make sure that the gates were plumb, because that's just the way my dad was. You ever wanted to build a garage slowly, build it with my dad. You put a piece of plywood up, you get the plumb bob back out. Even though my dad is gone, his lessons are not. The lessons of how my dad worked at creating a path for God and for God's glory to be revealed in his own life and in the life of his community. Roslyn, where I was raised, and then North Cape May, when he retired. For me, creating a path for God in my life includes spending the first part of my day in prayer and devotions. Now, I haven't reached the point of Luther yet. You know, it was Luther who once said, I have so much to do today, I shall spend the first 3 hours in prayer. But I've learned how important those 30 minutes can be before I face the tasks that are before me. One way of creating a path for God in a community is saying publicly that racism and bigotry of any kind is contrary to God's call to love our neighbor and welcome the stranger. And spray painting white power and swastikas on 2 business properties in our community is not acceptable. That's why I didn't hesitate to participate in creating a press release for Monroe County United condemning this ugly incident and offering a comment for publication, which, by the way, wound up on the cutting room floor. It's why I'm attending the press conference on Monday, announcing the formation of the Interfaith Rapid Response Network. So I've shared with you how I'm creating a path for God in my life, and one way I'm creating a path for God in this community. How are you creating a path for God in your own life and in our community? For God's glory to be revealed. Amen.